The year is 1943. The skies over Europe are filled with the thunderous roar of Merlin engines as British RAF pilots climb into their Spitfires and Hurricanes, knowing that each mission might be their last. But there's something terrifying happening that has nothing to do with enemy fire. Something invisible. Something that's killing experienced pilots faster than the Luftwaffe ever could. Over 300 skilled aviators have already died, not from bullets or flak, but from a mysterious killer that strikes without warning at 20,000 feet. Their planes simply fall from the sky, spiraling downward as their pilots lose consciousness, unable to pull up, unable to save themselves. The RAF is desperate. Engineers are baffled. Every day that passes, more names are added to the casualty list. And then, in a small workshop tucked away from the chaos of war, a woman whose contributions would later be dismissed as merely tinkering with a worthless piece of brass is about to solve a problem that the greatest minds in aviation couldn't crack. Her name was Beatrice Schilling, though everyone called her Tilly, and she was about to prove that sometimes the most elegant solutions come in the smallest packages. But to understand the magnitude of what she accomplished, we need to go back to where this deadly mystery began. Picture yourself in the cockpit of a Supermarine Spitfire in the early years of World War II. You're flying at altitude, scanning the skies for enemy aircraft. Suddenly, you spot a formation of German Messerschmitt fighters. Your training kicks in. You push the stick forward to dive on the enemy, to gain speed and tactical advantage. But instead of the surge of power you expect, your engine coughs, sputters, and dies. In that moment of vulnerability, you're a sitting duck. The Messerschmitt you were hunting is now hunting you. This wasn't happening to one or two pilots. This was an epidemic. The problem was specifically affecting aircraft equipped with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, which powered both the Spitfire and the Hurricane, Britain's primary fighters during the Battle of Britain and beyond. These engines were masterpieces of engineering, capable of producing over 1,000 horsepower and pushing these aircraft to speeds exceeding 350 miles per hour. But they had a fatal flaw that only revealed itself in combat conditions. When a pilot pushed the nose down into a dive or performed certain negative G maneuvers, the carburetor would flood, cutting fuel flow to the engine. For precious seconds that felt like hours, the engine would die, leaving the pilot powerless. In aerial combat, seconds mean the difference between life and death. German pilots in their Messerschmitt Bf 109s didn't have this problem. Their aircraft used fuel injection systems that worked flawlessly, regardless of the aircraft's attitude. This gave them an enormous tactical advantage. British pilots learned quickly that if a German fighter dove away from them, they couldn't follow. If they tried, their engine would quit, and they'd be helpless. Instead, they had to perform a roll, and then pull through into a dive, a maneuver that cost precious time, and often meant the difference between shooting down the enemy and letting him escape. Imagine the frustration. You're flying the most advanced fighter aircraft Britain can produce. You're trained to the peak of perfection, and yet you can't perform one of the most basic combat maneuvers without your own aircraft betraying you. The psychological impact on pilots was devastating. They were being asked to fight with one hand tied behind their backs. The RAF's technical branches were in crisis mode. The best aeronautical engineers in Britain were assigned to solve this problem. They knew what was happening. The carburetor was flooding during negative G maneuvers. But finding a solution that could be implemented quickly across thousands of aircraft was proving impossible. Traditional fixes would require completely redesigning the fuel system, possibly switching to fuel injection like the German aircraft used. But that would take years of development and testing, years that Britain didn't have. In 1940 and 1941, Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. The Soviet Union hadn't yet been invaded. America hadn't yet entered the war. If the RAF failed, if Britain lost air superiority, invasion was a very real possibility. Every day this problem went unsolved, more pilots died, more aircraft were lost, and Britain's desperate situation grew more desperate still. This is where Beatrice Schilling enters our story, and what a story she had even before this moment. Born in 1909, Tilly Schilling grew up in a time when women were actively discouraged from pursuing careers in engineering or science. But Tilly wasn't interested in what society thought she should or shouldn't do. From an early age, she was fascinated by machines, by how things worked, by the challenge of solving mechanical problems. She didn't just want to understand engines. She wanted to build them, modify them, make them better. At a time when most women weren't even allowed to attend university, Tilly earned a degree in mechanical sciences from the University of Manchester. But she didn't stop there. She went on to earn a master's degree in engineering, one of the first women in Britain to do so. Her passion extended beyond academics. Tilly was a motorcycle racer, competing at Brooklands, the famous motor racing circuit, reaching speeds of over 100 miles per hour on machines she'd modified herself. She understood engines not just in theory, but in practice, in the real world where tolerances, temperatures, and pressures all interact in complex ways. In 1940, she was working at the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough, one of the only women in a male-dominated environment. Many of her colleagues initially dismissed her. A woman engineer was almost unheard of, and some assumed she was there to fill some diversity quota or as a token gesture. They were about to learn how wrong they were. When the carburetor problem became critical, Tilly was assigned to investigate it. She approached the problem differently than the others. While many engineers were thinking about complex redesigns and major modifications, Tilly went back to basics. She didn't just study blueprints and specifications. She talked to pilots, real combat veterans, who described exactly what happened in the cockpit when the engine failed. She flew an aircraft herself, experiencing the problem firsthand. She understood that whatever solution she developed, it had to be simple, effective, and most importantly, it had to be something that could be manufactured and installed quickly across the entire fleet. Britain didn't have the luxury of time. The carburetor on the Merlin engine was a float-type carburetor, similar in principle to the carburetor on a motorcycle or car from that era. Fuel entered a chamber where a float controlled the fuel level, much like the float in a toilet tank controls water level. From this chamber, fuel was drawn into the engine based on airflow and throttle position. The system worked perfectly in normal flight, but when the aircraft nosed over into a negative G maneuver, gravity no longer held the fuel in the float chamber properly. Instead of a controlled fuel level, fuel would surge forward, flooding the carburetor and simultaneously starving the engine of the correct fuel-air mixture. It was a simple problem of physics. Gravity was an essential part of how the carburetor worked, and when you took gravity away or reversed it, the whole system failed. Previous attempts to solve this had focused on modifying the float chamber, adding baffles, or redesigning the fuel delivery system. None of these solutions worked well enough or could be implemented quickly enough. Tilly's genius was in thinking smaller and simpler. What if, instead of trying to prevent the fuel from surging, you simply restricted how much fuel could flow in the first place? If you limited the maximum fuel flow to something just slightly below what the engine needed at full power, the engine would run almost normally in all conditions. But you'd prevent the catastrophic flooding that was killing pilots. The restriction would have to be precise. Too much restriction and you'd rob the engine of power, potentially leaving pilots unable to climb or accelerate when they needed it most. Too little restriction, and you wouldn't solve the flooding problem. Tilly calculated the exact flow rate needed and designed a solution that was breathtaking in its simplicity. A small brass disc with a hole in the center, a washer essentially, that would be installed in the fuel line leading to the carburetor. This restrictor, This piece of brass, no larger than a coin, would limit fuel flow just enough to prevent flooding during negative G maneuvers, while still allowing the engine to produce about 90% of its normal power. That 10% loss was a compromise, but it was a compromise pilots could live with. What they couldn't live with was their engines cutting out entirely in combat. When Tilly first presented her solution, the reaction was mixed. Some engineers were skeptical that such a simple fix could solve a problem that had baffled them for so long. Others were almost insulted that this woman was suggesting that a mere washer could do what their complex solutions could not. But Tilly had done her calculations. She'd tested her theory. She knew it would work. The proof came in flight testing. When the restrictor was installed and test pilots put the aircraft through the maneuvers that had previously caused engine failure, the Merlin kept running. It didn't produce quite as much power as before, but it didn't quit. Pilots could now dive on enemy aircraft without fear. They could perform defensive maneuvers that had previously been suicide. The tactical playing field was leveling. The restrictor became known officially as the RAE restrictor, named after the Royal Aircraft Establishment, but pilots and ground crew had another name for it. They called it Miss Schilling's orifice, a cheeky reference that Tilly herself apparently found amusing. Despite the informal name, there was nothing but respect from the pilots whose lives this simple device saved. The implementation was remarkably swift. Because the restrictor was so simple, it could be manufactured quickly and in huge quantities. Installation took minutes, not hours or days. Maintenance crews could install them in the field without specialized tools or training. Within months, thousands of RAF aircraft had been fitted with Miss Schilling's orifice. The impact on combat effectiveness was immediate and dramatic. British pilots could now engage German fighters on equal terms. The Messerschmitt's advantage in dive performance was neutralized. More than that, pilot confidence soared. They were no longer flying aircraft that might betray them at the crucial moment. They could focus entirely on fighting the enemy, not fighting their own machines. The death toll from engine failures during combat maneuvers plummeted. Pilots who would have died, who would have become names on a memorial wall, instead survived to fight another day, to protect British skies, to eventually help turn the tide of the war. But here's where our story takes a turn that reveals something profound about how history remembers contributions, especially contributions made by women. After the war, when historians and aviation enthusiasts began documenting the technical achievements that helped win the conflict, Tilly's contribution was often overlooked or minimized. The restrictor was described in some accounts as a crude temporary fix, a stopgap measure until proper solutions could be developed. The phrase, "worthless brass washer," appeared in some dismissive accounts, as if the simplicity of the solution somehow diminished its importance. This attitude reveals a persistent bias in how we value innovation. There's a tendency to assume that the most complex solution is the best solution, that true genius must be complicated and difficult to understand. Tilly's restrictor violated this assumption. It was simple. It was elegant. It could be explained to anyone in minutes. And perhaps most threatening to some, it was designed by a woman in a field that was supposed to be exclusively male. The truth is that Tilly's solution demonstrated the highest form of engineering excellence. Any engineer can make something complicated. The real challenge is making something simple that actually works. As the saying goes, perfection is achieved not when there is nothing more to add, but when there is nothing left to take away. Tilly's restrictor was perfect in this sense. It couldn't be made any simpler and still solve the problem. Moreover, her solution had to account for real-world constraints that pure theorists often ignore. It had to be manufacturable with wartime resources. It had to be installable by mechanics in the field. possibly in makeshift workshops or even outdoors. It had to be reliable without requiring precision maintenance. It had to work in the harsh conditions of combat, with extreme temperatures, vibrations, and stresses. By every measure that actually mattered, Tilly's solution was brilliant. But brilliance isn't always recognized, especially when it comes from unexpected sources. Tilly herself never sought glory or recognition. By all accounts, she was focused on the work, on solving problems, on making aircraft better and safer. After her success with the Merlin carburetor, she continued working on aircraft engines throughout the war and beyond. She developed improvements to superchargers, worked on engine cooling systems, and contributed to countless other projects. Her career spanned decades, and she became one of the most respected engineers in British aviation, though often quietly, without the public recognition given to her male counterparts. She was eventually awarded an OBE, Order of the British Empire, for her contributions. But this came late in life, and seemed almost an afterthought compared to the honors heaped on others whose contributions, while significant, weren't necessarily more impactful than hers. The story of Tilly Schilling and her restrictor raises important questions about how we recognize achievement and how bias, sometimes unconscious, shapes our understanding of history. How many other contributions by women and minorities have been minimized or forgotten because they didn't fit the expected narrative of who gets to be a genius or a hero? The technical community has, in recent years, begun to properly recognize Tilly's achievements. Modern engineering students learn about her solution as a case study in elegant problem-solving. Aviation historians now properly credit her with saving countless lives and potentially changing the outcome of the Battle of Britain and the air war over Europe. But this recognition came decades too late, long after Tilly herself passed away in 1990. Let's think more deeply about what was at stake during those critical months when the carburetor problem was killing British pilots. Britain in 1940 and 1941 was in existential danger. The British Expeditionary Force had been evacuated from Dunkirk, leaving behind most of its heavy equipment. France had fallen. The Soviet Union was still bound by the non-aggression pact with Germany. America was officially neutral. Britain stood alone against the Nazi war machine that had conquered most of Western Europe in a matter of weeks. The Royal Air Force was the thin blue line between Britain and invasion. If the Luftwaffe gained air superiority, German invasion forces could cross the Channel with relative impunity. Britain's navy was powerful, but without air cover, ships are vulnerable. Everything depended on the RAF's ability to contest the skies over Britain. And the RAF was losing pilots at an alarming rate, not just to enemy action, but to this mechanical flaw that made their aircraft unreliable in combat. Every pilot lost was a blow Britain could ill afford. Training a fighter pilot took months and significant resources. Experienced pilots, those who had survived multiple combats and learned the deadly lessons of aerial warfare, were irreplaceable. When 300 pilots die from a mechanical problem, you're not just losing 300 individuals. You're losing thousands of hours of combat experience, tactical knowledge, and that indefinable quality that separates adequate pilots from ace pilots. You're also losing the morale impact of knowing that your own aircraft might kill you, even if the enemy doesn't. Imagine being a young pilot, barely 20 years old, climbing into your Spitfire, knowing that if you get into a dogfight and need to dive, your engine might quit. Every mission becomes a gamble, not just against the skill of enemy pilots, but against your own equipment. The psychological toll of this uncertainty cannot be overstated. When Tilly's restrictor was implemented and pilots realized they could now maneuver without fear of engine failure, the relief must have been overwhelming. Suddenly, the Spitfire and Hurricane became the aircraft they were meant to be, nimble fighters that could take on the Luftwaffe on equal terms. The tactical implications were enormous. British fighters could now employ the same diving attacks that German pilots used. They could disengage from unfavorable fights by diving away. They could perform aerobatic maneuvers that would have been suicidal before. The restrictor didn't just save individual lives. It changed the fundamental dynamics of air combat over Europe. Historians have debated what might have happened if this problem hadn't been solved. Some argue that Britain would have found another way, that the resourcefulness and courage of British pilots would have prevailed regardless. Others suggest that without this fix, the RAF might have suffered unsustainable losses, potentially losing air superiority and leaving Britain open to invasion. We can never know for certain what might have been, but we do know what actually happened. The problem was solved, quickly and effectively, by an engineer who saw past complex theories to a simple, practical solution. And that engineer was a woman, working in a field that told her she didn't belong. Tilly's story is also a reminder of the countless women who contributed to the war effort in technical and scientific roles that were traditionally reserved for men. The narrative of World War II often focuses on male soldiers, pilots, and leaders. Women's contributions are frequently limited to stories of nurses, factory workers, or code breakers. Important roles certainly, but not the full picture. Women like Tilly Schilling were designing the aircraft, improving the engines, solving the technical problems that made victory possible. They were doing this while facing skepticism and discrimination, while being paid less than their male colleagues, while being expected to prove themselves over and over in ways men never had to. After the war, many of these women were pushed out of their technical roles to make room for returning servicemen. The progress toward gender equality in engineering and science slowed dramatically. It would be decades before women would again achieve the kind of presence in these fields that they had during the war years. Tilly was fortunate in that she was able to continue her career, but many others were not. The knowledge and experience of countless talented women engineers and scientists was simply discarded because society decided that these roles were meant for men. Think of the innovation lost, the problems that might have been solved, the advances that might have been achieved if these women had been allowed to continue contributing. It's a sobering reminder that discrimination and bias don't just harm individuals. They harm society as a whole by wasting talent and potential. In the specific case of the Merlin engine carburetor problem, we can trace a direct line from Tilly's solution to Allied victory in the air war. The Spitfire and Hurricane, freed from their mechanical handicap, proved more than capable of defeating German fighters. British pilots, confident in their aircraft, pressed home attacks and defended their homeland with effectiveness that shocked the Luftwaffe. The Battle of Britain, that critical struggle in the summer and fall of 1940, might well have had a different outcome if British fighters had continued to suffer from engine failures during combat maneuvers. While Tilly's restrictor was implemented after the height of the Battle of Britain, it was crucial in the years of air combat that followed. As the war progressed and the Allies took the offensive, British aircraft ranged over occupied Europe, providing cover for bombers, attacking German positions, and fighting to control the skies. Every mission benefited from the reliability that Tilly's simple brass washer provided. It's worth taking a moment to appreciate the engineering elegance of her solution from a technical standpoint. The restrictor worked by creating a controlled bottleneck in the fuel flow. Under normal conditions, this bottleneck didn't significantly affect engine performance because the carburetor didn't need more fuel flow than the restrictor allowed. But during negative G maneuvers, when the float chamber would normally flood and dump excessive fuel into the carburetor, the restrictor prevented this surge. The fuel that did get through was just enough to keep the engine running. The restrictor essentially turned a catastrophic failure mode into a minor performance reduction. Instead of the engine quitting entirely, it just produced slightly less power during the brief moment of negative G. For a pilot, this was the difference between life and death. The engine might not be running at peak performance for a few seconds, but it was running, and that's what mattered. Another brilliant aspect of Tilly's design was that it was passive, meaning it required no moving parts, no electronic controls, no pilot input. It simply worked, automatically and reliably, every time. This passive reliability was crucial in combat aircraft, where anything that can fail eventually will fail, and usually at the worst possible moment. A complex solution with valves, sensors, and controls might have worked better in theory, but in practice, it would have been a maintenance nightmare and a potential point of failure. Tilly's restrictor, being just a piece of brass with a hole in it, couldn't fail. It couldn't wear out, couldn't get stuck, couldn't malfunction. As long as it was installed, it worked. This reliability meant that pilots could forget about it and focus on flying and fighting. It's also important to understand that Tilly's solution, while simple in concept, required precise engineering to implement correctly. The size of the orifice had to be calculated exactly. Too large, and it wouldn't prevent flooding. Too small, and it would starve the engine of fuel, even in normal flight. The material had to be chosen carefully, something that wouldn't corrode or deform with the vibrations and temperature changes of flight. The installation method had to be foolproof, so that mechanics in the field couldn't accidentally install it incorrectly. All of these details required careful thought and testing. Tilly didn't just have a clever idea. She developed that idea into a practical, implementable solution that worked reliably across thousands of aircraft in varied conditions. This is the difference between a theorist and an engineer. Engineers have to make things work in the real world, with real constraints and real consequences for failure. From a historical perspective, the story of Miss Schilling's orifice also illustrates how warfare drives innovation. The urgent need to solve the carburetor problem pushed engineers to find solutions faster than would ever happen in peacetime. The normal processes of development, testing, and certification were compressed. Risks were taken that wouldn't be acceptable in normal times. But this urgency also meant that unconventional solutions and unconventional problem solvers got a chance to prove themselves. In peacetime, Tilly might never have been assigned such a critical problem. The institutional bias toward male engineers might have kept her in less important roles. But war creates chaos, and in chaos, talent can sometimes rise regardless of gender or background, especially when the alternative is defeat. This doesn't excuse the discrimination Tilly faced, but it does explain how she got the opportunity to make such a significant contribution. The war created a temporary meritocracy, where solving problems mattered more than maintaining social hierarchies. Sadly, as mentioned earlier, this meritocracy largely disappeared after the war ended. Looking at the broader context of aircraft development during World War II, the Merlin engine carburetor problem was just one of many technical challenges that had to be overcome. Aircraft were being pushed to performance levels never before achieved. Pilots were flying higher, faster, and in more extreme conditions than anyone had thought possible just a decade earlier. Each new performance threshold revealed new problems. Early jets had problems with flameouts at high altitude. High-speed aircraft encountered compressibility effects that made controls ineffective. Long-range aircraft faced navigation challenges over featureless oceans. Each problem required innovative solutions, and those solutions came from engineers and scientists working frantically to keep pace with the demands of combat. Tilly's contribution was one star in a constellation of innovations, but it was a bright star, one that saved lives and changed outcomes. The human cost of the carburetor problem deserves emphasis. 300 pilots dead. Each one was a person with hopes, dreams, families, and futures. Each one had survived the rigorous selection and training process to become a fighter pilot. Each one climbed into their aircraft willing to face the enemy, only to be killed by a flaw in their own machine. Think of the tragedy of dying not in combat against the enemy, but because your engine quit when you pushed the stick forward. Think of the frustration in those final moments, knowing that your training and skill mean nothing because your aircraft has betrayed you. And think of the families receiving the news that their son or husband or brother had been killed, never knowing that it wasn't enemy action, but a mechanical problem that took their loved one. When Tilly's restrictor was implemented and these needless deaths stopped, each life saved represented not just a number, but a person who got to continue their story. Some of these pilots survived the war and went on to have families, careers, full lives that they never would have had without that simple brass washer. Others died later in combat, but at least they died fighting, not helplessly falling from the sky because their engine quit. There's a profound moral dimension to engineering that's often overlooked. Engineers create things that people depend on. When those things fail, people can be hurt or killed. The responsibility that comes with this is enormous. Tilly understood this responsibility. She knew that pilots were dying because of the problem she was trying to solve. She knew that every day without a solution meant more casualties. This wasn't an abstract intellectual puzzle for her. It was a matter of life and death. This sense of urgency and responsibility drove her to find a solution that was not just theoretically sound, but practically implementable immediately. As we near the end of this story, it's worth reflecting on what we can learn from Tilly Schilling's achievement. First, that simple solutions are often the best solutions. In our modern world, we tend to overcomplicate things, to assume that complexity equals sophistication. Tilly reminds us that true genius often lies in simplification, in finding the elegant solution that cuts through complexity to address the core of the problem. Second, that diversity in problem-solving teams leads to better outcomes. Tilly approached the carburetor problem differently than her male colleagues, perhaps because she had different experiences and perspectives. If the engineering team had been more diverse from the start, the problem might have been solved sooner. Homogeneous groups tend to think alike and miss solutions that are obvious to outsiders. Third, that we must be vigilant about bias in how we recognize and celebrate achievement. Tilly's contribution was minimized for decades because she was a woman in a male-dominated field. How many other crucial contributions have been similarly overlooked? What talent are we wasting today by maintaining barriers based on gender, race, or background? Fourth, that practical experience matters as much as theoretical knowledge. Tilly was not just an engineer with degrees. She was someone who worked on engines with her own hands, who raced motorcycles, who understood machines in a visceral, intuitive way that complemented her technical knowledge. We need educational and professional systems that value this combination of theory and practice. Finally, that individuals can make a difference. One person, working on what seemed like an intractable problem, found a solution that saved hundreds of lives and changed the course of history in a small but meaningful way. We often feel powerless in the face of large problems, but Tilly's story reminds us that focused effort and creative thinking can overcome enormous challenges. Beatrice Tilly Schilling passed away in 1990 at the age of 81. She had lived to see her contribution properly recognized, at least within the aviation and engineering communities. She had continued working on aircraft engines for decades after the war, always innovating, always solving problems, always proving that her success with the restrictor was no fluke. In her later years, she apparently remained modest about her achievements, deflecting praise and insisting she had simply done her job. But those who flew with engines improved by her work. Those who survived combat because their Merlin didn't quit at the critical moment. They knew better. They knew that this woman, working in her workshop with her calculations and her brass washers, had given them something precious. the confidence that their aircraft would respond when they needed it most, that they could focus on fighting the enemy rather than fighting their own machines. Today, Miss Schilling's orifice is remembered as a classic example of elegant engineering problem-solving. It's taught in engineering schools as a case study. Aviation museums display examples of the restrictor alongside the Spitfires and Hurricanes it helped make effective. And slowly, painfully slowly, Tilly Schilling herself is being recognized as one of the unsung heroes of World War II. A woman whose brilliance and determination helped save Britain in its darkest hour. The next time you hear someone dismiss a solution as too simple, or suggest that if something seems easy, it must not be valuable, remember the story of the worthless brass washer that saved 300 lives, and countless more. Remember the woman who designed it, working in a world that told her she didn't belong, that her contributions didn't matter, that engineering was men's work. Remember that she proved them all wrong with a piece of brass the size of a coin, and a mind that saw clearly when others were lost in complexity. And perhaps, when you face a seemingly impossible problem, you'll remember to look for the simple solution, the elegant answer that's been hiding in plain sight. That's the legacy of Beatrice Tilly Schilling, not just a restrictor that saved lives, but a reminder that innovation comes from unexpected places, that simplicity is sophistication, and that one person, no matter who they are or what obstacles they face, can change the world. Those RAF pilots who climbed into their Spitfires and Hurricanes after the restrictor was installed, who dove on enemy aircraft without fear, who survived the war and went home to their families. They were living testaments to the power of one woman's brilliant, simple solution to a problem that had killed hundreds of their brothers in arms.